What if the biggest royal scandal of the decade had nothing to do with affairs, feuds, or family betrayals, and everything to do with money? Not just any money, not private inheritance, not speaking fees, but money that was never meant to be touched for personal ambition at all. What if the question isn't whether Prince Harry and Meghan Markle wanted independence, but how they quietly paid for it? Because for years, we've been told one simple story. A clean story. A marketable story. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. They walked away. They stood on their own. They built an empire from scratch. But what if that story has a hidden prologue? Let me ask you something directly. If you were truly financially independent, why would your earliest business moves leave such faint, careful footprints? Why would the funding be layered? Why would the paper trail feel incomplete? Why would so many answers rely on "trust us" instead of documents? And why, of all people, would a trusted friend suddenly become the name whispered around alleged financial records? That name is Nacho Figueras, not a banker, not a palace accountant, not a Hollywood executive, but a man who stood close enough to see what others couldn't. A man whose loyalty was never publicly questioned. A man who, according to allegations, came into possession of financial information that was never meant to leave a closed circle. This is not a story about proven guilt. It's a story about contradictions, about timing, about money that doesn't quite sit where it should. And once you see the pattern, it becomes very hard to unsee. For years, Prince Harry presented himself as someone trying to escape a system that controlled him, restricted him, defined him by birthright rather than choice. And Meghan Markle was portrayed as the catalyst, the woman who helped him imagine a life beyond royal protocol, beyond deference, beyond silence. A love story framed as liberation. But liberation costs money. A lot of it. And that's where the story starts to feel incomplete. Because when the couple announced their departure from royal duties, they didn't just step away emotionally. They stepped into one of the most expensive professional arenas on earth. Hollywood, streaming platforms, production companies, development deals, global branding. These worlds do not open their doors on goodwill alone. They require investment long before cameras ever roll. Development costs, consultants, pitch decks, legal reviews, quiet meetings, preliminary staff, all before a single contract is signed. So ask yourself this: where did that early money come from? We're told the deals came later. Netflix, Spotify, big numbers, headlines. But deals don't appear out of thin air. They're built slowly, strategically, and usually expensively. Publicly, the message was clear. Harry and Meghan were forging their own path. Privately, according to allegations now circulating, there may have been a bridge, a financial bridge, and that bridge may have been built using funds that were never meant to support personal ventures. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Not all royal money is the same. There's private wealth. There are inheritances. There are allowances. And then there are restricted royal trust funds. Funds governed by rules. Funds earmarked for official duties. Funds that are not supposed to touch private commercial activity. If those funds are used improperly, the issue isn't gossip. It's governance. It's accountability. It's the kind of thing institutions do everything possible to avoid airing publicly. Now, before anyone rushes to conclusions, this story lives firmly in the realm of allegations. No court verdict, no formal charges. But allegations don't emerge in a vacuum. They emerge when patterns collide with silence. And silence, in this case, has been loud. Consider this. For a couple who have spoken extensively about transparency, truth, and telling their story, there are certain financial questions that have never been answered clearly. When asked how early projects were funded, the answers become vague. When timelines are compared, things don't quite line up. When journalists push for clarity, the subject changes. Why? Is it simply privacy? Or is it because the truth is more complicated than the narrative allows? This is where the alleged involvement of Nacho Figueras becomes explosive. Because according to whispers, leaked conversations, and second-hand accounts, he wasn't just a friend. He was someone trusted with logistics, with introductions, with connections, and possibly with paperwork. The kind of paperwork that doesn't make headlines until it does. Imagine for a moment what it would mean if restricted royal funds were quietly redirected. Not in one dramatic transfer. Not in a way that triggers alarms. but in small, carefully structured movements. Enough to fund development, enough to pay advisors, enough to keep momentum alive until public deals could take over. If that sounds like speculation, that's because it is. But speculation becomes harder to dismiss when multiple sources point toward the same unanswered question. Why did the earliest phase of Meghan's media ambitions appear unusually well-resourced before any major contracts were announced? Why did insiders reportedly describe an operation that felt already funded? Why were certain services paid for before the world knew what was coming? These are not accusations. They are gaps. And gaps demand curiosity, especially when the institution involved, the British royal household, has every incentive to keep those gaps unexamined. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. If restricted funds were misused, the fallout wouldn't just land on Harry. It would raise questions about oversight, about approval, about who knew what and when, which explains something else that has puzzled observers for years. The palace's silence. Not outrage, not denial, not clarification. Silence. Silence can mean many things. It can mean there's nothing there. Or it can mean that acknowledging the question creates a bigger problem than ignoring it. Institutions choose silence when the cost of explanation is higher than the cost of rumors. So why now? Why are these allegations resurfacing at this moment? Why is Nacho Figueras' name suddenly being connected to alleged records? Why are financial questions that were brushed aside years ago coming back with sharper edges? Because time has changed the context. The deals are no longer new. The narratives have aged. The public has become more skeptical. And when stories age, people start looking backward. They start asking how things really began. They start comparing what was said to what actually happened. And sometimes, someone decides they're tired of carrying silence alone. This introduction isn't here to prove anything. It's here to frame the mystery. Because if even part of these allegations holds weight, then the story of Harry and Meghan's exit isn't just about freedom. It's about strategy. It's about money. And it's about whether royal rules were quietly bent to fund a very modern ambition. And the most unsettling part? The alleged issue may not be how much money moved, but how quietly it moved. Because according to one source, the problem wasn't that funds were used. It was that they were used so cleanly that no one noticed. Until now. And that brings us to the first question we need to ask. Why would the person holding the earliest clues not be a royal insider, but a friend? Because in the next section, we're going to look closely at the man no one expected to be at the center of this story. And once you understand how he fits in, the entire picture begins to shift. Section complete. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Why him? That's the first question everyone asked when this story started to circulate quietly behind closed doors. Why would the name attached to alleged financial records not belong to a palace official, not to a royal accountant, not to a disgruntled staffer, but to a friend who was always smiling in photos, a friend who seemed safely outside royal drama, a friend no one ever suspected of holding anything dangerous? So ask yourself this. When secrets are truly sensitive, who do people trust with them? Not enemies, not institutions, friends. Because friends don't file reports. Friends don't leak until something changes. And according to multiple whispers, something did change. Nacho Figueras was never just a casual acquaintance in Prince Harry's orbit. He wasn't background noise. He wasn't a distant social contact. He was part of a small, curated inner circle, one built on trust, loyalty, and discretion. That matters. Because proximity isn't about how often you're photographed together. It's about what conversations happen when cameras are gone. Late nights, quiet logistics, favors that don't feel like favors at the time. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Nacho wasn't a royal insider, but he didn't need to be. He didn't answer to palace protocol. He wasn't bound by institutional silence in the same way staff were. And he operated in a world where money, sponsorships, and financial structures were normal conversations. That combination alone should make you pause. Because when you're trying to move quietly, the safest person is often someone who doesn't look like a gatekeeper. Think about it. Would you hand sensitive paperwork to someone who clocks in and out under royal supervision? Or would you trust someone who moves freely, who owes loyalty to you, not to an institution? Now let's slow this down, because this part matters. Publicly, Nacho Figueras is known as a polo player, a model, a brand ambassador. But privately, he has long existed in elite financial ecosystems where sponsorship deals, private funding, and complex money flows are the norm. That doesn't mean wrongdoing. It means familiarity. And familiarity lowers friction. When someone understands how money moves quietly, they don't panic at paperwork. They don't ask unnecessary questions. They don't draw attention. They handle things. So when allegations suggest that Nacho may have seen, or held, financial records linked to early funding efforts, the shock isn't that he was involved. The shock is that people assumed he never would be. And that assumption is what allowed silence to thrive. Let me ask you something directly. If you were planning a transition that required funding before public deals were finalized, who would you trust to help coordinate without asking too much? A courtier bound by rules, or a friend who understands discretion? This isn't about accusing Nacho of wrongdoing. This is about understanding why his name being attached to alleged documents is so disruptive, because it breaks the illusion that the story was simple. And simple stories don't need intermediaries. Complex ones do. Here's what makes this even more unsettling. According to those familiar with the allegations, Nacho wasn't acting independently. He wasn't freelancing. He wasn't running side operations. If he was involved at all, it was because someone else needed him to be. That shifts the spotlight away from the man holding papers and toward the person who allegedly handed them over. Prince Harry has often spoken about trust. Who he trusts, who betrayed him, who protected him. In his world, trust is currency. So when we examine why Nacho would allegedly be in possession of sensitive financial material, we have to examine the emotional dynamics first, not the spreadsheets. Harry didn't grow up trusting institutions. He grew up trusting people, friends, soldiers, teammates, people who felt real. And that's why this story can't be reduced to numbers alone. Because if there was an attempt to move restricted money quietly, and again, we are dealing with allegations, it wouldn't have been done through cold bureaucracy. It would have been done through relationships. Here's another uncomfortable question. Why hasn't Nacho publicly denied any involvement? In modern scandals, denial is almost automatic. Lawyers issue statements. Representatives push back. Rumors are dismissed. But silence lingers here too. And silence from someone with nothing to hide usually doesn't last. Unless speaking creates consequences. Unless denying one thing opens the door to questions you can't control. Silence is often chosen not because it's safe, but because it's safer than the alternative. And the alternative, in this case, might involve explaining how certain documents ended up outside expected channels. Now consider this. If Nacho truly had nothing, absolutely nothing, to do with any financial logistics, why would his name keep resurfacing in connection with alleged records? Rumors fade when they're wrong. They don't echo. They don't resurface years later with sharper edges. They don't align with broader unanswered questions about early funding. Which brings us to a crucial contradiction. For years, we've been told Harry and Meghan were escaping control. But escaping control doesn't mean escaping structure. Hollywood is more structured than royalty in many ways. Deals require planning. Funding requires foresight. You don't walk into streaming negotiations empty-handed. So again, where did the early support come from? According to some accounts, Nacho was present at key transitional moments. Moments when plans were forming. When futures were being mapped. When financial needs were discussed quietly, not publicly. Was he a witness? A facilitator? A holder of information? The truth is, we don't know. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes this story volatile. Because uncertainty paired with silence creates space for suspicion. And suspicion grows when institutions refuse to clarify. Another angle that rarely gets discussed. If Nacho did see documents tied to restricted royal funds, that doesn't automatically mean misuse. It could mean oversight. It could mean temporary custodianship. It could mean something entirely benign. But the problem is, no one has explained it. And when explanations are absent, narratives fill the gap. This is why the palace's approach matters so much. Because the palace could shut this down with clarity. They could explain funding sources. They could confirm timelines. They could put questions to rest. But they haven't, which leaves people staring at the messenger instead of the message. Nacho becomes the headline, the distraction, the human shield between the public and the uncomfortable question behind him. Who authorized what? And why? And here's the part that quietly unnerves royal observers. If restricted funds were never touched, proving it would be straightforward. Accounts exist. Rules exist. Audits exist. So why hasn't anyone said, clearly and simply, this did not happen? Why instead is there a fog of non-statements, vague references, and silence? Because sometimes denial creates more risk than ambiguity. And ambiguity buys time. Time for stories to cool. Time for public attention to move on. Time for details to remain buried. But time also has a way of doing the opposite. It makes people curious. It makes journalists dig. It makes old friends reassess their loyalties. Which brings us back to Nacho. Friends don't become risks overnight. They become risks when circumstances change, when narratives diverge, when loyalties are tested, when someone feels exposed without protection. And if Nacho ever felt caught between silence and implication, that alone could explain why his name now hovers over alleged records. Not as a villain, but as a hinge between private planning and public fallout. So as we move forward, keep this in mind. This story isn't about a polo player turning whistleblower. It's about how secrets move through trust networks, and how those networks crack under pressure. Because once a friend becomes part of a financial story, the question is no longer whether money moved. It's who thought it would never be noticed. And in the next section, we're going to examine the money itself. Not the rumors, not the relationships, but the specific kind of royal funds that were allegedly involved. And why their misuse would change everything. What if the most dangerous money in the monarchy isn't the most famous? What if the real risk isn't diamonds, estates, or castles, but something far quieter? Because when people imagine royal wealth, they picture spectacle, gold, palaces, ceremony. They do not picture spreadsheets. They don't imagine trust instruments written in dense legal language. They don't think about restrictions, clauses, or conditions that follow money like shadows. But those shadows are where the real power lives. And that's exactly why this chapter matters. Because to understand why the allegations around Prince Harry feel so explosive, you have to understand the kind of money being whispered about. This isn't private inheritance. This isn't money from book deals or speeches or media appearances. This is a very specific category of royal funding that exists for one purpose only: duty. Royal trust funds are not slush funds. They are not personal checking accounts. They are not flexible safety nets. They are governed. They are restricted. They are watched. And once you understand how tightly controlled they are, you'll understand why even the suggestion of misuse makes institutions freeze. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't realize. Not all royal money belongs to the royals. Some of it belongs to the crown as an institution. Some of it exists only because a role exists. And some of it disappears the moment that role ends. Royal trusts are designed to support official responsibilities, public engagements, security tied to duty, staff connected to representation, operational costs that come with being a working royal. They are not designed to bankroll private ambition, not film pitches, not production companies, not personal brands. So if funds from a restricted trust were ever used to support early media development, even indirectly, that wouldn't be bending a rule. It would be crossing a line. And that's why people lower their voices when this topic comes up. Because crossing that line doesn't just embarrass a family. It challenges the integrity of the system itself. Now let's slow down and be precise. Allegations suggest that during the transition period, when Prince Harry was stepping away from royal duties but had not yet fully established independent income streams, money may have moved. Not dramatically, not recklessly, quietly. The kind of quiet that avoids headlines. And if you're wondering why this matters so much, ask yourself this. Why would anyone risk touching restricted funds when they knew massive deals were coming? Why not wait? Why not hold off until contracts were signed? The answer, according to those familiar with early Hollywood development, is simple. Momentum. You don't pause ambition while waiting for paperwork. Streaming platforms don't chase ideas that feel underdeveloped. They chase readiness. They chase momentum that already looks funded. And readiness costs money. Here's something most viewers never hear. Before a major media deal is signed, millions can be spent quietly, not publicly announced, not reported, not visible. Development teams, consultants, strategy advisors, brand architects. These are not luxuries. They are prerequisites. And that's why the timeline matters. Because silence becomes a strategy. and that silence has been deafening. Ask yourself this. Have you ever heard a clear, detailed explanation of how Harry and Meghan funded the earliest phase of their media operations? Not generalities. Not phrases like private means, specifics, dates, sources, mechanisms. You haven't. And that absence fuels suspicion. Because transparency would shut this story down immediately if there were nothing to hide. Now consider another angle that rarely gets discussed. Royal trust funds don't move without approvals. They require oversight, which means if misuse occurred, it likely wasn't a solo act. Someone would have had to look away. Someone would have had to justify a payment. Someone would have had to classify an expense creatively. And that's where the story becomes bigger than one man. Because institutions protect themselves first. They don't rush to accuse their own. They don't volunteer internal weaknesses. They contain. And containment often looks like silence. Now imagine being inside that system. Imagine knowing that an investigation could expose not just one misstep, but a culture of quiet accommodation during a chaotic transition. Would you invite scrutiny? Or would you hope the story dies quietly? That hope is why this story keeps resurfacing. Because it never fully died. It lingered. It waited. And now, years later, with relationships strained and loyalties shifted, it's being asked again. What happened to the money before the deals? And why does no one want to answer? Let's be clear again. No court has ruled. No authority has charged anyone. This remains allegation. But allegations tied to restricted funds carry weight because of what they imply. They imply access. They imply trust. They imply a system that may have bent to protect an exit narrative. And if that's even partially true, it would explain something else that has puzzled observers. Why the palace allowed the financial independence narrative to stand unchallenged. Because challenging it might require explaining details they didn't want examined. Better to let the public believe a simplified story. Better to let headlines move on. Better to avoid reopening old ledgers. And here's the emotional core of this chapter. This isn't about greed. It's about urgency. Transitions are messy. Exits are chaotic. And when someone feels cornered, financially, emotionally, publicly, they don't always make clean choices. They make effective ones. But effective choices can still be wrong, especially when rules are involved. And that's why this story matters. Because it asks a question that goes beyond Harry and Meghan. It asks whether royal systems are flexible when they shouldn't be. Whether loyalty can override governance. Whether silence is used to protect people or protect institutions. And here's the most unsettling part. If restricted funds were never touched, proving it would restore trust instantly. Yet proof hasn't come. Only quiet. Only distance. Only carefully worded non-answers. Which brings us to the next logical step. If money moved quietly, it didn't move directly. It moved through layers. Through intermediaries. Through structures designed to soften scrutiny. And in the next section, we're going to examine the moment when public statements collided with private realities. The claim that changed everything. The phrase that sounded empowering, but may now look misleading. We are financially independent. Because once you interrogate that statement, the entire timeline starts to unravel. What if the most powerful line in this entire story wasn't whispered in private, but spoken out loud? What if the sentence that shaped public sympathy, shut down questions, and reframed an exit wasn't just messaging, but armor? We are financially independent. Simple, clean, reassuring. Those 4 words did more than describe a situation. They closed a door. Because once that sentence landed, a lot of people stopped asking how the beginning was paid for. And that's exactly why we need to go back to it. Not emotionally, not ideologically, but chronologically. Because timelines don't care about intent. They care about order. And the order here is where things start to unravel. Let's rewind to the moment that phrase entered the public record. The couple had just announced their departure from senior royal duties. The world was watching. Speculation was everywhere. Would they struggle? Would they be cut off? Would they fade quietly into private life? Then came the declaration. They would fund themselves. No burden. No obligation. No reliance. The public response was immediate. Admiration. Support. Applause. A modern fairy tale pivot. But here's the first contradiction. Financial independence doesn't begin the day you say it. It begins the day your expenses are covered without outside support. And that's where this story gets complicated. Because independence isn't a moment. It's a process. and processes leave trails. Now ask yourself this. Between the announcement of independence and the signing of major streaming deals, what happened financially? Because that gap matters more than anything that came after. Deals with Netflix and Spotify didn't materialize instantly. They took time, negotiations, development, back and forth. And during that time, the bills didn't pause. Security costs, staff, legal teams, consultants, travel. And if, as publicly stated, royal funding had stopped, something else had to take its place. That something else is where questions start piling up. Let's talk numbers, not rumors. Independent experts have estimated that the annual cost of security alone for a high-profile couple like this could run into the millions. Add staff, add advisors, add relocation. Now add a new layer, media development. Because while independence was being declared, something else was happening quietly in the background. Ideas were being shaped. Projects were being conceptualized. Meetings were being arranged. This wasn't downtime. It was groundwork. And groundwork is expensive. So here's the contradiction. If financial independence was immediate, the resources required for early media groundwork should have come from clearly identifiable private sources. Inheritance, savings, loans, investors. Yet no detailed explanation was ever offered. Instead, the phrase financially independent was allowed to do all the work. It functioned like a curtain. And behind that curtain, according to allegations, the picture wasn't as clean. Let me ask you directly. Have you ever heard a detailed breakdown of how the earliest phase of Meghan's production ambitions was funded? Not later, after deals, but before. You haven't. And that absence isn't accidental. Because explaining it would require specifics. And specifics invite scrutiny. Another contradiction. If Harry was financially cut off abruptly, as has been suggested, then why wasn't there a visible period of financial constraint? No slowdown. No pause. Instead, there was acceleration. Brand launches, high-profile relocations, media engagement. Momentum didn't dip. It increased. And momentum requires fuel. Now let's examine the psychology of that declaration. We are financially independent wasn't just information. It was positioning. It signaled strength. It signaled control. It signaled readiness. And in Hollywood, readiness attracts deals. Platforms don't want projects that feel fragile. They want confidence, stability, infrastructure. So that sentence wasn't just for the public. It was for decision makers. It said, we're already standing. But here's the uncomfortable follow-up. Standing on what? Because if restricted royal funds were still accessible during that transitional window, even temporarily, that changes the meaning of independence entirely. It doesn't mean the statement was false. It means it may have been premature. And premature declarations often hide bridges. Bridges built to get from one reality to another. Now consider how institutions handle premature truths. They rarely correct them. They let them stand. Because correcting them requires explaining complexity. And complexity threatens narrative control. So instead, the simplified story becomes official. And anyone who questions it is framed as cynical or hostile. But skepticism isn't hostility. It's curiosity. And curiosity is what this story demands. Another angle that deepens the contradiction. If Harry truly believed he was independent, he may not have viewed the use of transitional funds, if any occurred, as misuse. He may have seen it as temporary continuity, a buffer, a bridge. But rules don't bend for belief. Restricted funds don't care about intention. They care about use. And that's why this distinction matters. Because even well-intentioned decisions can still violate structure. And institutions judge structure, not emotion. Now ask yourself this. Why didn't the palace publicly challenge the independence claim? They could have clarified. They could have said, support will continue temporarily under specific conditions. They didn't. They allowed the phrase to stand unqualified, which benefited everyone, until it didn't. Because now, years later, that phrase is being re-examined under a harsher light. And under that light, it doesn't look as solid. It looks strategic. Another detail that raises eyebrows. The couple often framed their independence as an escape from control. But independence usually comes with reduced access, reduced resources, reduced protection. Yet access didn't seem to diminish immediately. Security arrangements continued. Logistical support appeared intact. Operational sophistication remained high. which again raises the same question. Who was paying, and under what authority? If the answer is purely private money, proving it would be simple. Statements, audits, clarifications. But instead, we have silence. And silence paired with a bold declaration creates tension. That tension is why this phrase keeps coming back. Because it's the hinge between public narrative and private reality. Now let's talk about timing again, because timing is everything. The independence claim came before any public media deal, which means it wasn't backed by visible revenue streams at the time. It was a promise, a projection, and projections require faith. Faith from the public, faith from partners, faith from platforms. And faith is easier to secure when there's unseen support stabilizing the ground. This is where allegations about restricted royal funds become relevant, not as proof, but as explanation. They offer a possible answer to a question that otherwise makes no sense. How did independence look so smooth? How did the landing feel so soft? How did the infrastructure appear so fast? Without a bridge, it shouldn't have, unless the bridge existed but wasn't named. And if that bridge involved money that wasn't supposed to be used for personal ventures, the Declaration of Independence takes on a different tone. Not false, but incomplete. And incomplete truths are often more damaging than lies, because they mislead without technically deceiving, which is why this story refuses to settle. Because people sense the gap. They feel it. They may not articulate it, but they recognize when a story skips steps. And this one skipped a crucial step. The how. So as we move forward, keep this phrase in mind. We are financially independent, not as a statement of fact or fiction, but as a strategic moment. A moment that shaped perception. A moment that bought time. A moment that may have masked a financial bridge built quietly behind the scenes. Because in the next section, we're going to step into the world where that bridge allegedly led. The early shaping of Meghan's media ambitions. Not the deals you heard about, but the blueprint you didn't. And once you see how that blueprint forms, the funding question becomes impossible to ignore. Section complete. But what came next would expose just how much work had already been done, long before anyone knew to look for it. What if the real story didn't begin with a contract, but with a blueprint? Because long before press releases, long before streaming logos appeared beside royal names, something else was taking shape quietly. Ideas don't turn into empires by accident. They're engineered. And engineering requires planning, structure, and, most importantly, resources. So let me ask you this. Have you ever wondered why Meghan's media ambitions felt unusually polished right out of the gate? Not experimental, not tentative, but fully formed, as if the groundwork had already been laid. That's because, according to those familiar with early discussions, it had. And this is where the story takes a decisive turn away from speculation and into structure. Because media deals don't begin with cameras. They begin with documents, pitch decks, vision statements, narrative arcs, market positioning, all of it invisible to the public, and all of it expensive. Meghan Markle has often been described as intentional, strategic, forward-thinking. Those traits don't emerge in a vacuum. They require teams, advisors, creative consultants, industry translators who know how to convert personal narrative into commercial product. And that conversion doesn't happen on instinct alone. It happens through process. Now here's the part that matters most. That process started before the deals, before Netflix, before Spotify, before anyone outside a small circle had any idea what was coming, which means someone funded the beginning. Let's talk about how media blueprints are actually built. When a public figure wants to enter the production world, especially at the level Meghan aimed for, there's a standard path. First comes concept development. What is the brand? What is the voice? What is the through line? Then comes positioning. Is this aspirational, activist, intimate, educational? Then comes packaging. Which platforms fit? Which executives should hear it? Which genres travel globally? Each step involves specialists. And specialists don't work for exposure. They work for fees. So when insiders describe Meghan's early pitches as fully realized, that tells us something important. This wasn't casual brainstorming. It was professional-grade preparation. Now pause here. If this level of preparation existed before public independence was financially established, where did the funding come from? This is the question no one wants to answer directly, because answering it pulls the thread that unravels everything. Consider the timing again. The exit announcement had barely settled when whispers of creative ambitions began circulating. Not announcements, whispers. Private meetings, quiet introductions, early interest. That kind of momentum doesn't follow chaos. It follows coordination. And coordination requires someone paying the bills. Another uncomfortable detail. Hollywood executives have privately noted that Meghan's early proposals didn't feel like first attempts. They felt like second or third drafts. Refined, strategic, market-aware. That implies rehearsal. And rehearsal costs money. So let's be honest with ourselves. This wasn't a couple sitting at a kitchen table sketching dreams on napkins. This was a deliberate media strategy being assembled piece by piece. And according to allegations, that assembly phase may have been quietly supported by money that was never meant to touch private commercial work. Not as a lump sum, not as an obvious transfer, but as a series of enablers. Consultant fees, strategic retainers, operational costs framed as something else. Again, allegation, not proof, but a plausible explanation for a very real phenomenon. The blueprint existed early, and blueprints don't appear for free. Now here's where emotion enters the story. Meghan didn't want a hobby. She wanted impact. She wanted control over narrative. She wanted to tell stories on her own terms. And that desire makes sense. But desire doesn't override structure. And it doesn't override rules. Which brings us back to the alleged funding source. If restricted royal trust money was still accessible during this transitional window, it would have represented the easiest solution. No outside investors to answer to. No loans to explain. No delays. Just continuity. A financial bridge between royal duty and private ambition. And bridges feel harmless when you're crossing them. You don't think about whether you're allowed to use them. You think about getting to the other side. Now ask yourself this. If you believed your future earnings would cover everything eventually, would you view early support as borrowing or as entitlement? That mindset matters because it shapes decisions. And it shapes how those decisions are justified internally. This is where the blueprint becomes more than a plan. It becomes evidence of intent. Not intent to deceive, intent to build. But building without clarity about funding boundaries creates risk, especially when public narratives are involved. Another angle worth considering. Why did Meghan's media strategy lean so heavily on authenticity and transparency? Because authenticity sells, but it also deflects. When you foreground emotion, people stop asking about logistics. They focus on feelings. And feelings are harder to audit than finances. That doesn't mean the strategy was deceptive. It means it was effective. And effectiveness often hides complexity. Now think about how this blueprint was received once deals became public. The reaction wasn't surprise. It was validation. Oh, that makes sense. Of course she's producing content. It fits. That reaction tells us something. The groundwork had already prepared the audience subconsciously, which again suggests that planning began earlier than most realized. And planning earlier means funding earlier. So we return to the same unresolved question. Who paid for the unseen phase? Because no matter how you slice it, someone did. And if the answer were simple, it would have been shared. Instead, we have silence. And silence invites scrutiny. Another detail that adds weight to the allegations. The blueprint wasn't limited to one platform. It was flexible, adaptable, designed to appeal to multiple buyers. That's not accidental. That's sophisticated. And sophistication requires experienced guidance. Guidance that doesn't come cheap. So when we hear that Meghan's pitches were circulating quietly, already refined, already aligned with platform priorities, we have to ask how that alignment was achieved so quickly. Hollywood takes time, unless preparation starts early. And early preparation requires funding that predates revenue. Now let's connect this back to the phrase that opened the last chapter. We are financially independent. If that statement came after the blueprint was already funded, it reads differently. Not as a description of reality, but as a declaration of destination. A destination already in sight because the path had been paved. And that's why this chapter matters. Because it reframes Meghan's media ambitions not as a sudden pivot, but as a planned transition. One that may have relied on resources that were never meant to support it. And again, this isn't about judgment. It's about sequence. Sequence reveals truth. And the sequence here suggests that the machine was already running before the world was told it existed. Now here's the final emotional beat before we move on. If you believed you were building something meaningful, something that would ultimately justify early support, would you? Netflix doesn't sign blank checks for ideas that don't already feel real. That's not how the industry works. They don't invest in uncertainty. They invest in readiness. Which means by the time executives say yes, most of the risk has already been absorbed elsewhere. Development has happened. Concepts have been stress-tested. Market positioning has been refined. And that work happens before contracts. Which brings us back, again, to funding. Because if Netflix wasn't paying for the earliest phase, someone else was. And here's where the contradiction sharpens. The deal was announced as if it solved the money question retroactively, as if success in the present justified opacity in the past. But deals don't work backward. They don't rewrite history. They don't explain how early costs were covered. They simply make people stop caring. And that's exactly what happened. For a long time. Now let's talk about why Netflix matters so much psychologically. Netflix is cultural authority. When Netflix signs you, it signals legitimacy. It tells the world you're not experimenting. You're established. And once legitimacy is established, scrutiny softens. Questions feel unnecessary. Skepticism feels mean-spirited. And that's why the Netflix deal functioned like a shield. It didn't answer questions. It buried them. But buried questions don't disappear. They wait. And years later, they resurface with sharper edges. Here's another detail most people miss. The Netflix deal wasn't just a production agreement. It was a branding partnership. It required infrastructure, offices, teams, legal frameworks. And that infrastructure doesn't spring into existence on announcement day. It already existed. Which means by the time Netflix came on board, the machine was already built. Or at least partially built. So again, who paid for that machine? Because Netflix didn't fund the blueprint. They funded the execution. And execution only happens once the groundwork is proven. This is where the timeline becomes impossible to ignore. The exit announcement, the independence declaration, the early media blueprint, and then Netflix. That order matters. Because it suggests that the deal wasn't the start of independence. It was the proof of concept that made earlier risk-taking look justified. And that reframes everything. Because if early funding came from restricted royal sources, even temporarily, it would explain how the leap felt so smooth. It would explain why there was no visible scramble, no pause, no visible instability. It would explain why the story jumped from exit to empire with no visible bridge. And again, this isn't about accusing Netflix of anything. Netflix is the stage, not the actor. The question isn't what Netflix did. It's what Netflix made invisible. Because once the deal existed, nobody wanted to rewind. Nobody wanted to examine the months before. Nobody wanted to ask uncomfortable questions about early support. And institutions rely on that human instinct. We don't like complicating success stories. We prefer neat arcs. Struggle, breakthrough, triumph. But real life is messy, eh? And sometimes the breakthrough is supported by things we're not meant to see. Another contradiction worth examining. If the Netflix deal truly represented independence, why did financial questions continue to linger quietly afterward? Why were there still whispers about funding sources? Why did certain journalists keep circling back to the same early period? Because deals don't erase uncertainty when the origin story feels incomplete. And the origin story here has gaps. Now think about messaging. The Netflix announcement was framed as empowerment, control over narrative, creative freedom, a new chapter. But empowerment narratives work best when the past feels resolved. And the past here wasn't resolved. It was skipped. Which means the Netflix deal didn't end the story. It postponed it. Another angle that adds complexity. Netflix deals are often structured in phases. Not all money arrives at once. Milestones matter. Deliverables matter. Which means early funding still matters, even after signing. If early groundwork wasn't privately funded properly, pressure would remain. Pressure to deliver. Pressure to justify investment. And that pressure could incentivize silence around early support. Because admitting transitional help would complicate the independence narrative. And independence was the brand. Now ask yourself this. If the story was truly clean, why hasn't anyone laid out a simple timeline? Exit announcement. Funding sources. Development costs. Deal signing. That timeline would end speculation instantly. But no such timeline exists. Instead, we have a highlight reel. And highlight reels never show behind-the-scenes work. Which is why Netflix becomes such a powerful distraction. It gives the audience a climax. And once the climax hits, no one wants to rewind. But investigative stories don't work that way. They rewind by design. And when you rewind here, you hit the same unresolved question again and again. How did the machine get built before Netflix paid for it? Because it did get built. That's not opinion. That's observable. And observable facts demand explanations. Another emotional beat that often gets overlooked. The Netflix deal also protected relationships. Once success is public, friends stop questioning. They celebrate. They congratulate. They don't ask how the first steps were funded, which means anyone who knew about early support suddenly had cover. Silence became easier, not because people forgot, but because the story no longer needed correction. Until now. Because now, the Netflix deal isn't new anymore. The excitement has faded. And with distance comes perspective. And perspective brings scrutiny. People are looking back again. At the early interviews. At the Independence Declaration. At the rapid development of media infrastructure. And they're noticing something. The math doesn't quite add up. And that's why this chapter matters. Because it reframes the Netflix deal not as a solution, but as a lens. A lens that magnified success while obscuring origin. And when that lens shifts, everything underneath becomes visible again. Which leads us to the next uncomfortable truth. If early funding did move quietly, it likely didn't move directly. It would have moved through layers. Small transfers. Intermediaries. Structures designed to soften scrutiny. And in the next section, we're going to examine how money moves when it's not meant to be noticed. Not in theory, but in practice. Because once you understand how quiet money works, the earlier questions stop feeling abstract. They start feeling specific. And specificity is dangerous. What if the problem was never the amount of money, but the way it traveled? Because loud money leaves noise. Quiet money leaves patterns. And patterns are far more dangerous. Let me ask you something. If you needed to move funds without drawing attention, would you make one big, obvious transfer? Or would you break it into pieces? Small enough to feel routine. Ordinary enough to avoid questions. Justified enough to pass through oversight without triggering alarms. That's how quiet money works. And once you understand that, a lot of things start to make sense. This is the part of the story where people often get uncomfortable. Because it's easier to imagine dramatic wrongdoing than subtle maneuvering. But real-world financial controversies rarely explode. They seep. They pass through cracks in systems that trust their own people. And royal systems are built almost entirely on trust. Trust in discretion. Trust in hierarchy. Trust that no one would ever abuse access. That trust is what makes quiet movement possible. Let's talk about how restricted funds would allegedly move if someone didn't want them noticed. Not hypothetically, practically. First, you don't label anything honestly. You classify. Security-related costs. Operational continuity. Transitional expenses. Words that sound official. Words that belong. Because restricted funds aren't audited line by line in real time. They're reviewed periodically, which means timing matters. Small expenditures spread across time don't stand out. They blend. And if those expenditures support activities that could be framed as transitional duty-related needs, they slide through. This isn't speculation. This is how large institutions function. They rely on norms. And norms create blind spots. Now apply that logic to the period we're discussing. A chaotic transition. An unprecedented exit. Unclear rules. Blurred roles. That's the perfect environment for quiet money. Because oversight weakens when definitions are unstable. Is this still duty-related? Is this transitional? Is this temporary? Those questions don't always have clear answers in real time, which creates opportunity. Now here's the key distinction. Quiet money doesn't move to enrich. It moves to enable. It pays consultants. It funds retainers. It keeps operations running. It doesn't scream luxury. It whispers continuity. And continuity is easy to justify during upheaval. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable possibility. If early media development was framed internally as part of future-proofing or transition planning, it could have been justified, at least temporarily, using restricted resources. Not because someone thought they were breaking rules, but because they believed the rules were in flux. That belief matters, because it reframes intent. Not malicious, not greedy, pragmatic. But pragmatism doesn't override governance. And that's where institutions get nervous. Because proving misuse doesn't require proving bad intent. It requires proving improper use. And improper use can happen quietly. Now let's talk about intermediaries. Quiet money rarely goes directly from A to B. It moves through C, D, and E. Consulting firms, advisory retainers, third-party services. Once money leaves the original source and enters a layered structure, tracing it becomes harder. Not impossible, but harder. And harder often equals avoided. Especially when tracing opens doors institutions would rather keep closed. Now ask yourself this. If restricted funds were never misused, why hasn't anyone explained the structure of early payments? Why hasn't there been a clean breakdown of how early consultants were paid? Who retained them? Under what authority? Those answers exist somewhere, but they haven't been shared, which suggests either extreme caution or something to protect. Another angle worth examining. Quiet money relies on plausible deniability. If questioned, each step appears reasonable in isolation. Each payment looks justified. Each decision seems contextual. No single action triggers outrage. It's only when the pattern is viewed as a whole that questions arise. And patterns take time to see. Which is why this story didn't explode immediately. It needed distance, perspective, and a reason to look backward. That reason, according to whispers, may be the resurfacing of early financial records. Not dramatic revelations, not smoking guns, just ordinary documents that look slightly wrong in hindsight, dates that don't align, classifications that feel stretched, expenses that don't match outcomes. Those inconsistencies don't prove anything, but they raise flags. And flags attract attention, which brings us back to the role of silence. Institutions don't rush to clarify when flags appear quietly. They monitor. They assess. They hope the issue resolves itself. Because addressing it publicly creates risk. Legal risk. Reputational risk. Institutional risk. And so, silence becomes policy. But silence also creates narrative space. Space for speculation. Space for storytelling. Space for people to connect dots that were never meant to be connected publicly. Another uncomfortable truth. Quiet money isn't rare. It's common, especially during transitions. What makes this situation unique is the narrative built around independence. Because once independence is declared, any ongoing support becomes suspect. And suspect support invites scrutiny. So if transitional funds were still flowing while independence was being publicly claimed, that contradiction becomes explosive, not because of the money itself, but because of the story told about it. Stories shape perception, and perception shapes judgment, which is why controlling the narrative became so important. Another question worth asking. Why would anyone risk quiet movement when massive deals were likely coming? Why not wait? The answer is timing. Hollywood momentum doesn't wait for public clarity. Opportunities appear and disappear quickly. Miss the window, and you're forgotten. So early funding becomes not just helpful, but essential. And essential things often get justified internally, even when they push boundaries. Now consider the human element again. Prince Harry was navigating loss, conflict, dislocation, pressure. This wasn't a calm, calculated corporate pivot. It was an emotional upheaval. An emotional upheaval doesn't produce perfect decisions. It produces urgent ones. Urgent decisions often prioritize outcomes over process. And that's where rules get bent, not out of malice, but out of momentum. This doesn't excuse anything, but it explains behavior. And explanation matters more than accusation. Because institutions don't investigate emotion. They investigate process. And process leaves records. Records that someone, somewhere, may now be looking at more closely. Which brings us to another critical point. Quiet money isn't invisible forever. It's just delayed. Eventually, someone asks the wrong question. Eventually, someone notices a pattern. Eventually, someone with access decides not to look away. And when that happens, silence becomes fragile. That's why this chapter matters. Because it moves the story away from personalities and into mechanisms. Mechanisms don't care who you are. They care how things moved. And if things moved in ways they shouldn't have, explanations will eventually be demanded. Now let's bring this back to the larger narrative. If money moved quietly to support early media development, it would explain the speed of the transition, the polish of early pitches, the absence of visible struggle, the confidence of public messaging. It would also explain why institutions have been reluctant to engage. Because engaging means opening the books. And opening the books risks finding something no one wants to explain publicly. So instead, the story stays unofficial, unconfirmed, unaddressed. But stories like this don't disappear. They evolve. They gain detail. They attract new voices. And they eventually force institutions to choose, clarify, or contain. And containment only works until someone inside the system stops cooperating. Which brings us to the next phase of this story. Because money doesn't move quietly alone. It moves within relationships. And relationships strain under pressure. In the next section, we're going to look at the one thing institutions fear more than financial scrutiny. Witnesses. Not enemies. Not critics. But friends who knew too much. Because when relationships crack, silence shatters. What if the most revealing response wasn't outrage, but nothing at all? Because in institutions built on ceremony, tradition, and hierarchy, silence is never accidental. Silence is chosen. And when it comes to the allegations we've been unpacking, quiet money, blurred transitions, early media funding, the most consistent response from the palace has been exactly that. Nothing. No detailed denial. No clarification. No public audit trail. Just distance. So the question isn't whether the palace noticed the whispers. The question is why they decided not to answer them. To understand that, you have to understand how royal institutions think. They don't respond like celebrities. They don't respond like corporations. They respond like systems designed to survive centuries. And survival is always the priority. Let's start with something uncomfortable. The palace does not rush to correct narratives unless those narratives threaten the institution itself. Personal embarrassment? They can absorb it. Family drama? They endure it. Public criticism? They wait it out. But structural scrutiny? That's different. Because structural scrutiny doesn't target people. It targets process. And once process is questioned, everything becomes fair game. Budgets, oversight, approval chains, internal controls. That's the kind of attention institutions fear. Not because they're guilty, but because exposure itself is destabilizing. So when allegations began circulating, quietly at first, about possible misuse of restricted royal funds, the palace faced a calculation. Responding would mean opening doors. Explaining would mean documenting. Documenting would mean acknowledging that the transitional period was messy, undefined, and potentially imperfect. And imperfection is the one thing the monarchy avoids admitting publicly. Now let's ask the obvious question. If the allegations were entirely baseless, why not shut them down immediately? A clear statement. A firm denial. A simple explanation of funding sources. That would have ended the story before it started. But instead, there was silence. And silence does two things simultaneously. It avoids immediate risk, and it allows speculation to grow. So why choose silence? Because sometimes speculation is safer than verification. Here's why. If the palace publicly denied misuse of restricted funds, it would need to back that denial with proof. Proof requires records. Records invite analysis. Analysis invites journalists, auditors, and watchdogs to ask follow-up questions. And follow-up questions are where institutions lose control, especially when the transition in question was unprecedented. There was no rulebook for a senior royal stepping back while retaining titles, security expectations, and global visibility. Everything was being negotiated in real time, which means decisions were made quickly, and quick decisions are rarely clean. That doesn't mean wrongdoing. It means ambiguity, and ambiguity is dangerous when exposed. So instead of clarifying, the palace did what it often does best. It waited. Let the story drift. Let public attention move elsewhere. Because time is the monarchy's greatest ally. But here's where that strategy starts to crack. Time doesn't erase records. It doesn't simplify timelines. It doesn't make questions disappear. It just delays them. And delayed questions often come back sharper. Another factor the palace had to consider. If they addressed the funding question publicly, they would implicitly validate it as a legitimate concern. They would elevate it. And once elevated, it wouldn't stay contained. People would ask, who approved transitional expenses? What classifications were used? Who signed off? Were exceptions made? And those questions don't stop at one individual. They spread. They implicate teams, departments, advisors, which means the story wouldn't be about Harry alone. It would be about institutional oversight. And that's the line the palace never wants crossed. So silence becomes containment. Not because it solves the issue, but because it keeps the blast radius small. Now consider another layer. Publicly challenging Harry's independence narrative would have been politically risky. At the time, public sympathy leaned heavily in his favor. Any attempt to undermine his claims could have been framed as punishment, cruelty,